Hey, it's another episode of On the Line. We are going to get you caught up on all the issues that Canadians are angry and anxious about right now. Gregory Jack is here from Ipsos. He's going to walk us through the political environment, why and how it's changing, and a long talk about immigration and whether or not Canadians are still in love with it. This is On the Line. This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Forestry For The Future. Canada's housing crisis demands bold, scalable solutions. Build Canada Homes is an opportunity to leverage Canadian wood in modern construction. Wood-based methods like mass timber and modular construction can significantly reduce build times, waste, and carbon emissions while supporting local economies. Expanding building codes, streamlining approvals, and prioritizing domestic wood in federal projects could double demand and foster job creation in rural and northern communities. Despite trade challenges and market volatility, a partnership between industry and government is vital to stabilize the sector, enhance competitiveness, and deliver innovative, sustainably sourced Canadian wood products for homes across Canada and abroad. With capacity growing across provinces, stable demand and predictable financing are key to unlocking the sector's potential. We need to build Canada Homes with Canadian wood. To learn more, visit forestryforthefuture.ca. Hey folks, look, total disclosure, we got a long weekend coming up. I am recording this episode early, so don't blame me if something weird happens in a couple of days. We're not going to talk about U.S.-Canada trade because I don't know if a trade deal is going to get announced over the Thanksgiving weekend. We're not going to talk about the Middle East because I don't know if the ceasefire is going to be a thing, if it's going to work, if the hostages are coming home. There's a lot of breaking news stories that have been happening when I'm recording this, and I can't keep up with them. It was a good opportunity for us, because we had to file this episode before the long weekend, to take a look at some of the bigger trends, take a look at some of the numbers. We and our buddies at Ipsos took a look at some of the key issues out there that are driving Canadians. We just had a federal election about, 5 months ago now, almost 6, where Donald Trump in the United States was the biggest issue. They're not anymore. We're going to tell you what is. Then we're going to have a conversation about immigration in this country. Canadians have really been great on immigration. They've been solid. They've supported immigration. They've supported immigrants, which are different things. We're going to talk about that. They've supported in general, diversity. Guess what? All those numbers are heading down. So stick around. It's a long conversation with Greg Jack of Ipsos, Senior Vice President there for Public Affairs, on all the issues that are dividing our people right now and animating our politics. So stick around and enjoy this episode of On the Line. Gregory Jack here with me once more. He is the Senior Vice President, or SVP, which rolls off the tongue. I really like that, of Public Affairs at Ipsos Canada. And I was teasing him before we started rolling here, because being Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at a public affairs company, I said it's like being SVP of engineering at an engineering company, but there you go. So Greg, I'm just going to acknowledge this. We're not going to try and pretend otherwise. Because of the Thanksgiving long weekend, we're recording this a couple of days in advance because my producer wouldn't be around when he normally would be.
Still got families. We should spend time with our families. You shouldn't have to work on Thanksgiving, so
that's the plan. Yeah, no, the plan is to get all the necessary line stuff done, and then I'm actually planning to take a couple of days off. So I flagged this right at the start because there may be news developments between the time when we record this and when it airs. So our intention today is not to be hyper-focused on specifics of the news. Our intention today is to take just a little bit of a more strategic look at some of the trends we're looking at right now. Coming up in a few minutes, you and I are going to have an extended conversation about immigration. And I asked you to pull some numbers specifically on immigration from the Ipsos files, basically, because you got data on this going back years. But I want to save that for like a specific part of the conversation. Let's have a more general conversation right now about some of the other issues out there. One of the things I asked you to do before you popped on is I just said, if you don't mind, take a peek at your latest numbers here. What are the issues, the top 5, top 10, however you define them here? Like, what are Canadians actually worried about right now? Because I have a hunch, but I want you to tell me what the data is first. And then if I'm right, I'm going to brag about it. If I was wrong, I'm going to pretend I was right all along.
Well, I think we've seen this in the media, and there's been a lot of talk about the return to basics for Canadians. So affordability, the economy, things that are pocketbook issues that we heard about in the last election that Mr. Poilievre really ran on until this giant other issue emerged, which was the president of the United States, Donald Trump. And I think Canadians have, we're sort of over that now. I wrote a piece in Global News a couple of weeks ago on this, and we've released some data on this. It's not that we're not worried about Trump, and we still feel like we can't trust the Americans the same way as we used to. But now we're back to worrying about what's going to happen in our own backyard. How are we going to feed our families? How are we going to have jobs? How is productivity going to increase? So these issues have resurfaced. The other issue that's come up, I think that I told you, Matt, before we started recording it, is crime. And crime is a concern globally. In fact, it's the top issue around the world in September. It's ahead of inflation, ahead of poverty, not by much, by 2%. So this is something that's happening in Canada as well. And we all read and hear in the news about crime happening in big cities, people not feeling safe. You guys have talked on the line a lot about the police effectively saying, wave the white flag and surrender. It's the best thing you can do. I know that the line has talked about how this is probably not the best way to run a society in the long run. And so this is not something that's only contained to Canada. This is something that's happening all over the world. But really what has happened in terms of priorities is we're back to the things we were worried about when the election was happening. And so not that Trump has gone away, but I think expectations, much like elbows, have been lowered.
Oh, you're going to get some snark in the comments for that one. Okay, a question for you about Mr. Trump then. I have a hunch that Mr. Trump, the degree of concern Canadians have around him, the White House, American policy, U.S.-Canada relations, but however you want to track it, and it probably pops up in a couple of different metrics you guys are tracking, I'm going to bet it looks bumpy. So Trump will say something, it gets picked up, boom, where the next poll that you guys roll or any of your competitors will roll will capture that. But then a couple of days will go by and Trump will be saying stuff about like Venezuela or Ukraine or something else. And then we won't be worried about it. And then we'll have bills to pay and our mom still won't be able to get her hip replacement or blah, blah, blah. And then the Trump stuff will drop. But then Carney goes to Washington like he did this week or last week by the time this airs. Trump makes a joke about a merger. All of a sudden, Canadians talking about it. Are you like, that's my hunch. Or is that actually reflected in the numbers that Trump sort of something that bounces along?
I think that's right. I mean, we asked a question about in the last 2 weeks, have Canadian-American relations gotten better, the same, or worse? And we definitely see a correlation between when something comes out of the States. Certainly, we saw the biggest jump in relations getting worse when the tariffs were brought in and Trump had Liberation Day. Most recently, we've seen people saying they're the same. So they're not getting better. About 14% think they're getting better, but it's okay, it's the same. But the one thing I would say about your analysis that maybe is going to change over the next little while is I think we're going to become increasingly immune to things like the Prime Minister going down to Washington. And if you look at the trip that he took, expectations were set very low from the beginning. Nobody was talking about walking out of there with a deal. He went in, he survived the encounter at the White House. Nothing horrible happened, and he came home. And so, there wasn't the wall-to-wall coverage we saw when he went down the first time or when Prime Minister Trudeau went down and they had that dinner at Mar-a-Lago. And of course, the president is saying things that are kind about Carney. He's saying he's a great man and the president wants to be a great man too. But the president is really setting expectations around what a deal is going to look like. And we heard his trade secretary saying the same thing. It's not going back to NAFTA in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s under Mulroney, or even what was negotiated under the last CUSMA. This is a president who has a different idea of what he wants trade to look like. And I think we're going to see a very different way of doing business in North America. Not necessarily good for Canada. But as I said on the issue stuff, Canadians have sort of tuned that out a little bit now. They're not over the Americans. They're not going to trust them the same way again. But they're also not worried about the trade and tariff stuff the way that we were earlier on. And you've seen that in the markets too. The markets are barely budging when things are coming out of the White House. Whereas back in April, every pin drop was causing a massive increase or decrease in the stock market.
Something I have felt, and I feel this as just a dude, like as a guy, I got a family to raise. I got parents my parents are still healthy, thank God. But you think about that when they get up near a certain age. Yeah, so I've got like a whole, sorry, this is more esoteric than I intended, but I have a whole personal life that has absolutely nothing to do with my work and the kinds of issues I talk about at work. And then there is my work, of course, and I'm constantly reading. I'm talking to guys like you. I'm absorbing information. And one of the through lines between both of those elements of the totality of Matt is that the party's over. And like, there's something I've been perceiving for years. And I tried to finally write about it a couple of years ago when I wrote Your Expectations Are a Problem, which I think is the most successful column I've ever published at The Line in terms of just people. It had a really long tail. Like, people keep clicking on it. And then every couple of years it pops up in some new Reddit and it gets 1,000 more reads overnight. What I was trying to capture was that you and me, roughly the same age, and a whole cohort of our peers who are now established in our careers, we're established in our family lives, but we're not yet sort of in that slow down and consolidate into retirement stage. These are, in theory, our prime earning years. That's what the conventional wisdom has always told us. And guys like you and I, and I'm not trying to say this is like generational victimhood here, we're dealing with wild stuff. And I can understand, you and I have talked about the generational divide in this country before. A lot of Canadians right now, older than you and I, are looking at their retirements and they have to safeguard them. They just need to keep the ship steady for 20 or 30 years, and then they'll die. Like, they'll get some great golf trips in and then they'll be done. You've got new Canadians who are, not new Canadians, younger Canadians who are just starting their careers and they're never going to buy a home. They're never going to be able to, like, work for them is completely precarious. And then guys like you and I are stuck in this weird position of having to adapt on the fly to just incredibly bizarre things. You talked about 1990s trade or 1980s trade. I lived virtually my entire adult life in the post-NAFTA United Trade, free trade, ever closer U.S.-Canadian relations era. That only changed for me like 8 months ago. And I don't know what that means yet here. I can understand guys like me getting fixated on this. But the other thing, like I said, the party's over. If my parents get sick, are they going to have a hospital? Just this morning, I was speaking to a friend of mine, a politically well-connected guy, affluent guy. He's struggling to find at-home care for his ailing father. He shouldn't be. Like, in a society where you'd think people would have the ability to call in favors, this guy would be pretty high on that list. He can't get a personal support worker to help his dad who just had major surgery. And you've mentioned crime already. Crime popping up in places that are not used to having crime here. Trump will go out and say something weird, and that will capture my attention for a week, maybe 2 weeks. But I'm still worried about a long-term care home in a couple of decades for my mom and dad. I'm worried about my car getting, pilfered through again in my driveway overnight. The hierarchy of needs transition has been pretty amazing because I'm just not worried about the same things today as I was 10 years ago. And I don't think it's because I'm 10 years older.
No, I think you touched on something really interesting when you said your expectations are the problem. I think that we have lowered our expectations in a lot of ways. I mean, healthcare is a great example, and I didn't mention healthcare in the top issues, but it's up there. It's always in the top three, and it's something Canadians are worried about. And we increasingly accept, a system that is not delivering what was promised or what even would have been unacceptable 20 years ago. COVID obviously put a great strain on the healthcare system. It put the office of the chief medical officer in the media spotlight. We started talking about vaccines. We'd never talked about that before. And so I think what's happened, and part of this is COVID, right? We've eroded what we expect the world to deliver. And you talked about guys our age, the 90s. I remember the 90s. I was a teenager. It was a great time. I wasn't thinking about global politics. But if we look back on the 90s, I mean, it was one of the only decades the United States hasn't been at war. We had generally peace. We had good relations with the Americans. The biggest front page stories were the president's dalliances in the White House and O.J. Simpson, right? And that car chase was going about 40 miles an hour. And so it seems, and obviously nostalgia is a powerful thing. It filters out all the bad stuff. But in retrospect, that was really the golden age of where we were in terms of national security and security of the country. We had the constitutional wars in Canada for sure. But 9/11 happened. It really changed things. And I think that if you look at our data, over the last 20 years, there has been a slow decline around a lot of the things that you're describing that you feel like happened abruptly, but they didn't. They happened over a period of time. COVID really messed with the algorithm because if you think back to just before COVID, things weren't looking great either. Our productivity wasn't very good. The deficit wasn't great. We had a lot of mistrust between Indigenous peoples and others and blockades and that. And all of a sudden that just kind of got wiped off the map when COVID happened, and we paused and we stopped worrying about whether or not these things could be resolved. And so we didn't worry about them for 5 years. But it's the same problems that have come back. You know, my brother said to me the other day that he wonders whether the world is better now that COVID has happened. Have we made improvements? And he feels that no, COVID actually set us back quite a bit. One of the things we looked at in our Ipsos Essentials tracking, which is a great monthly survey we have, and it started during COVID. It was initially a COVID thing, and we just ran the 100th wave. So we just had a webinar called From the Pandemic to the President, because literally this is kind of the period it's covering. And we looked at things, and what did you think was going to change in 2020 versus what has actually changed? Well, a bunch of people thought we'd be wearing masks everywhere we went. Turns out, no. A bunch of people thought that we'd be still working from home. Turns out, mostly yes, but that's starting to shift. A bunch of people thought that, pandemics were going to be something that regularly happened. Turns out that's not the case. A bunch of people thought that they would never go back to socializing the way that they used to. Well, we're back in the restaurants, but we're not going back to the movie theaters. So there's a bunch of things that I think changed significantly in that 5-year period that we're talking about. But all of the things you're talking about around expectations and what to worry about, those were slow burning problems that Canada and the world were kind of experiencing. And they've all kind of started to come to fruition. We're in what we at Ipsos call a polycrisis, where there's multiple things happening that we can't manage at the same time. But I don't think that your listeners would disagree that this is not something that has been foisted upon us all of a sudden. Mm-hmm. It's been one thing after another, and we haven't dealt with some of the smaller things. So they're all kind of piling up, if that makes any sense to you.
No, I think it does make sense. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at me as you were talking there, you talked a little bit about before COVID. And a little bit before COVID, if you had asked me a week before anyone had heard of Wuhan, what I thought the big issues facing Canada in 5 or 6 years would have been, I could have rattled off a bunch of things. And I think I mostly would have been accurate. Like, I think in a big picture sense, our productivity is an issue. National unity is an issue. Energy politics is an issue. Housing is an issue. Generational divide is an issue. There are things I would have missed, obviously. War, like October 7th and the invasion of Ukraine, hadn't happened yet. They would not have been on my radar. Mm-hmm. But I think what happened is this country had significant structural problems, not unsolvable problems, but structural ones. And COVID stripped off all the varnish.
Yep.
And, a process of either economic or political or social change that might have taken 20 years naturally, we're there in 3.
Yep.
And we're coming out of COVID, and we've still got all these problems we did before. And now we got a whole crap load of new ones. Something I was thinking about today, and I've already mentioned this to you, that I got a buddy of mine who's trying to figure out how to have his dad taken care of because he's recovering from major surgery. One of the issues that we used to talk as a country about a lot was the kind of the boomers, the age out of the boomers, the gray wave and things like that. And I was thinking about it this morning because something a very smart doctor told me a couple of years ago as we were talking about the healthcare system after the pandemic. He says, yes, the pandemic ended, the COVID surges on our hospitals stopped, but we have a sicker population overall. And I said, well, why? Is that like a COVID related thing? He goes, no, it's because we're older.
Yeah.
It was like on a population level basis, we have an aging population and we are 5 years further along that trajectory than we were. And that has pretty measurable impacts on the healthcare system every year in terms of people needing new hips or knees or cancer treatments or whatever it happens to be. And I feel like we've spent 5 years not fixing our problems. You talked about crime at the very beginning. You flagged that as one here. Crime to me is a fascinating issue. Because in terms of public policy problems, it's a hard one to eliminate, but it's a pretty easy one to address. Yeah. Like there's a whole lot of Band-Aids you can slap on that problem in the meantime. Maybe it never goes away, but you can address it. And I'm looking around at the response federally, provincially, and municipally in this country, and we ain't doing it. I'd already told Jen this in one of our podcasts recently, but I was recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was downtown Toronto for a dinner. I left the restaurant. We had a nightcap at a hotel bar after that. And by the time I left the hotel bar, it was about 1 a.m. The streets had completely transformed. It sounds like I'm mocking. I'm not. There were right where I was, right at Yonge and Bloor in Toronto. There was 3 or 4 people in view while I stood there waiting for a cab who were doing the zombie shuffle, who were so drugged out on whatever their substance was that they were slouched over, shuffling around. I grew up in this town, and I've seen bad areas in it. The bad areas are everywhere now.
Yeah. Well, and it's happening more and more in major cities. And I think crime's an interesting one because, you know as well as I do, and your listeners would know as well, that crime is obviously correlated with economic downturns. And we're going to talk a little bit later about immigration. I'm not in any way implying that's one is causing the other, but there are relationships there. The other thing that I think is important is, when I started my working career in the year 2000, we all talked about the baby boomers retiring and we all move into the workforce, except they never retired. I mean, they've started to now. And somebody said to me once, retirement is going to be a one generation thing. It was the boomers and maybe to a certain extent some of the early Gen Xers who are going to get to retire. But for a lot of people, they're not going to. And they're going to have to keep working for a bunch of reasons. And then to your point, our healthcare system is not going to be equipped to take care of this aging population. And by the way, Canada's population is declining because we're not letting in as many immigrants, and that's a policy choice. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. But on the flip side of that, that's going to create some pressures economically in terms of tax dollars. It's going to create pressures on how we pay for things, who's going to take care of the older generation. So we'll get to that after the break. But everything you say, I think, is absolutely true. And I think that it's just been a build of some of these things. COVID stripped the varnish off in the sense that it laid us naked in terms of how unprepared we were for this sort of thing. And it sucked a lot of resources out of the government and the population to address things. So we spent our reserve fund. And then now here we are, and we don't have the reserve fund anymore. So we have funny budget schedules and splitting things between operational and non-operational spending and that sort of thing.
We talk about spending the budget. I mean, we can talk about that in the sense of money. And Canada, from a fiscal perspective, still has room to spend. The economists tell me. But I think budget and deficits, it goes for other things like public faith, public tolerance, public risk, public appetite for change. Our political friends would call this just political capital. And for what we're talking about right now is probably closer to societal capital. We spent a friggin' ton of it in 2 years. And one of the honest things, Greg, and I know this is a very pandemic specific comment, and I guess it probably applies in other contexts as well. If you asked the Canadian people again to take on willingly some enormous sacrifice the way that we did with high levels of compliance in the early lockdowns, I don't think it happens. I don't think I'd do it. I don't think I would be defiant, and I don't think I would be contrarian, but I can guarantee you that I would be way more skeptical and just less inclined to listen to anything that didn't make sense.
Absolutely. And, your listeners know my colleague, he showed me some data the other day. I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically I said to him, it looks like this is suggesting that Canadians feel like they made sacrifices during the pandemic. They didn't get the payoff. And in fact, they got misery out of it. And I don't think that there is a willingness to follow the directions of authorities the way that there might have been before. And we've talked at Ipsos about the we versus me movement, right? Not that it was all we before, but that sense of community, the me first idea, which we see reflected, down in the States as well. I mean, there's a reason that Donald Trump got elected. Everybody likes to think that it's a bunch of people who are far right wing or whatever who did it. No, these are average Americans in a lot of cases who were doing this, even if it might look to us like it was against their self-interest. They were doing it because they were feeling like they weren't getting a fair shake out of things. And now we see the Americans acting on that me first, we're going to put America first. I think Canadians are doing that too. I think that we are less inclined to think about how the community is going to be affected or how we're going to help our neighbor, and more inclined to think about, what is in this for me and what is this going to cost me? And to your point about lockdowns and that, I mean, we've asked people, we would only know if we actually had to go through it, but I strongly suspect you're right, that there would be a lot more resistance if we had to repeat that. And part of that is that the government was telling us to do things, and then we didn't feel like we came out of it better off.
I think the me to we thing is interesting. And it's an interesting framework, because one of the things that I would add to that, and I think to your point about the Americans, this applies too. There are exceptions to this, because some people are jerks. Some people will always be jerks. Like some percentage of any population group is going to be jerks. But I think in general, I do not feel as though my fellow Canadians have harmed me. I'm not out for revenge against my neighbor. I do think there's some of that going on in our politics, but I think the bigger sense has been a collapse in faith in the institutions. So would I be more selfish today than I would have been 5-6 years ago? Absolutely. But it's not out of revenge or a sense of having been wronged. It's that I feel like it's a zero-sum game out there, and I've seen what's left of our state capacity. And if we have to deal with another crisis, I'm worried about people under my roof before I'm out there banging pots and pans for the healthcare workers, or, 2 weeks to crush the curve, or whatever the relevant slogan ends up being in the next crisis. And I think this is a fascinating issue because it crosses everything. It's crime, it's housing, it's politics, it's economics, it's healthcare. When people start to lose faith in the system, they start responding rationally, but not necessarily cooperatively. Yeah. And just a few days ago, I was speaking with some political friends of mine about this very issue, where, people are looking at some disturbing, how do I phrase this? There are indicators, and you probably see this in some of your data, where people are behaving, I don't want to call it anti-socially, but more asocially, like more of a prioritization of me first, my family first, things like that. Sort of a waning faith in collective institutions, dropping rates of community and civic participation and things like that. And I think it's very easy to look at that and go, well, that's bad. Like those are unhealthy societal indicators. You don't want to see that. But my response was, the problem, I can agree with that. That's bad on a societal scale, but on an individual level, it's probably rational. Like this is probably people looking at their own specific circumstances. And as human beings are designed to do, they're optimizing for their best possible outcome. It's not necessarily what the social scientists would want us to be doing, but it might make sense for me.
Yeah. No, I think that you're right, Matt. And I think that lack of faith in institutions is also something that's been going on for a long time. It started in the 70s with Watergate, which when we look back on that now, that seems quaint. That deterioration has gone on for a long time. One of the things we've also been talking about, and I've been reading as well, is about the idea of the rule of law and the idea that we only have a society that follows the law if we all collectively decide to follow the law because we think it's better for everyone if we do that. And, when we talk about the rise in crime and that, I think people are also feeling a little bit like, well, why should I? I'm not buying into this as much as I used to because what's in it for me? And so that becomes a really dangerous thing in the long run, because if you don't have collective agreement that we're going to follow the rule of law or that we're one society, then that becomes extremely problematic. We're going to have, going back to the politics next year, an election in Quebec where we might have a separatist government elected again. We have the Alberta government really taking their cues from what Quebec did the last 20 years and me over we, right? Alberta over the rest of the country. We haven't seen that a lot from other provinces. We haven't seen it from Premier Ford or other places, but we could, right? And then what happens to our federation if all the provinces start putting me over we? It might become a lot worse than we think it is.
I have two more questions for you, and one of them is about the cost of living issue, and we'll follow up on that in a minute. But another one relates to what we were just talking about there about, you brought it up, and I figured it's meaty, so let's jump at it. The issue of public safety. Some line readers will remember, we weren't even doing a podcast that I recall then. I think that was something we started later, but we'll remember that during the convoy in Ottawa, I went there and I mixed in and I wrote reports of what I was seeing, and I spoke to law enforcement and intelligence and government sources. And I wrote a series of articles that were very successful for us. And my conclusion was that the convoy required a law enforcement response, and that the convoy, particularly the border crossings, even more so than Ottawa, was a direct challenge to state power, and that the state needed to show that it could handle it, and, you know, to encourage the others. I won't inflict my French on anyone, but you know the saying, right? And it was important that the Canadian state, however you want to define that, because it depended, whatever agency you were dealing with differed based on the circumstances, but the Canadian state needed to win. It needed to basically go, no, this is wrong, this is illegal, and we are going to demonstrate that we have the power and the capacity to handle it. Because if we had not done that, that also sends a message. It sends a different message. And I still believe that to this day. I still think that the government was right to respond strongly. I think they took way too long to do it. I have not been able to avoid noticing the incredibly light hand that has been taken with incredibly disruptive protests nominally related to Gaza in many of our Canadian cities, and what has been absolutely increased and targeted harassment of Jewish communities here. And one of the things I've noticed is that people who are freaked out about one of those things tend to not be particularly freaked out about the other. And call me old-fashioned, Greg, but like, I believe that like we should have a law that is enforced by the police and then handled fairly uniformly by the court system. But we talked about rational responses. A lot of Canadians have looked at what's been happening the last two plus years, and they're drawing conclusions about who the police will and will not protect in this country. I don't know how we start to fix this, but like I said about the convoy, the state's got to start putting some points on the board here, or people will draw conclusions from that.
Well, it's funny because we have mentioned in our polls and asked people about support for things like the convoy versus supports for things like, Me Too or railroad blockades. And certainly we find some hypocrisy in people's beliefs about, well, if you believe in the cause of the folks in the convoy, it's a peaceful protest, what's the problem? Versus if you believe in the cause of somebody who's blockading a railway in that, well, that's okay. And you're quite right that there's not a lot of consistency in terms of what people think about that. But I think the lack of consistency on the part of the state is what you're getting at. And the fact that we're looking at laws that people would say are clearly being broken and nothing's being done. And so if you're going to do that, you're you're eroding the faith in the state to protect public safety. Number two, you're suggesting that maybe the laws aren't that important after all. Maybe it's really very subjective, which could lead to more people feeling like they can ignore them if they want to. And I live in Ottawa or close to Ottawa, and I was here during the convoy as well. And put aside the politics, because I think a lot of what happened with the convoy was, the conservatives met with them and supported them, and the liberals didn't. Put all that aside. What really happened, and Matt, you were here, is that the capital of Canada was occupied, and we lost control of the city for a brief period. And so, that can't happen. And if you weren't here, then maybe you might not have realized how difficult that was to live in, downtown or just doing business. All of the things that are kind of important to a well-functioning society ground to a halt for a couple of weeks. And the reason behind it, the politics is, I think, less important than the fact that was allowed to happen for as long as it did.
You know what? Call me old-fashioned, Greg, but I'm just a simple country girl. And show me a protest and show me the political response and the police response to the protest. In my ideal world, I cannot infer a single thing about the cause based on the response. I want the response to be so completely even-handed in every scenario that I've got to put on my middle-aged glasses and get close enough to read the friggin' signs before I know what the protest is about.
Well, we have started to infer reason behind something as a reason to apply or not apply a law. And that's been happening in a lot of areas, right? So,
mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-oh. Okay, one more question for you on the cost of living front. Cost of living is a big term. When we talk about cost of living, are you seeing particular stressors on Canadian people? Because obviously a year or two ago, it would have been inflation. Inflation is, for now, we'll see what happens if we get even more tariffs coming in. But for now, inflation is stabilized, kind of back where we would want it to be. When Canadians are telling you and your team that they're feeling pain on the cost of living front, where's the pain coming from? What actually hurts?
So, and Matt, we've talked about this before, and I think I've written about it as well. There's a generational thing going on, first of all. You younger Canadians are the ones really feeling the pain. They are more likely to say, well, I'm going to get up and leave this country if I can't get what I need. That's a real risk. Housing problems have not been fixed. That's still very high on the list of concerns. And you talked about guys in our age group who are established. We have a house. The other generation, the younger generation, doesn't see any way for that to happen. And the government has a real problem there, because if they devalue housing prices too much to help the younger generation, then guys like us and our parents who have houses are going to face a real problem, because a lot of people have built their retirement wealth in their house. But really, it's just the cost of day-to-day stuff. The thing about inflation that nobody talks about is that when it happens, it doesn't get undone. So if an apple goes from $1 to $2, and then it stops going up, it's still a $2
It's
apple.
still $2.
And and we've seen wages have been slowly catching up in some areas. But one of the things that I've really remarked on is how many labor disputes we've had recently, how everybody's willing to go on strike. I don't remember the labor movement being this strong in terms of, we had the Air Canada strike. We have the teacher strike in Alberta now. We have Canada Post. I'm sure there's others. I know the BC Public Service right now is on some form of strike. And so, this is happening more and more because the people are saying, well, my apple's still $2, and we're not seeing that increase and that made up. So I think the inflation is persistent in that way. It is now baked into the cost of things, and we haven't really realigned or readjusted our pricing or our wages to reflect that.
We'll talk about immigration in a minute, but it's just interesting. And I'm not saying this to complain because I'll get roasted for this, but let me tell you, I acknowledge this is an extremely first world problem. Okay. I'm just putting that out there. One of the things I noticed, over the summer, I was having dinner at a nice restaurant I go to from time to time with friends. It's a nice restaurant. It's an indulgence dinner. You're splurging when you go there, which is why I know this is not the most sympathetic statement I'm ever going to make here. One of the things I noticed was that the portions were much smaller and the quality of the meat was down. And like, oh, boo-hoo, columnist goes to steakhouse and steak is slightly tougher than normal. I get it. But it jumped out at me as just a really interesting data point. This is a restaurant people do not go to save money. Like, we weren't going to your local Montana's to get like the 8-ounce steak. This was a nice restaurant, and the food portions were much smaller, and the food wasn't quite as good. And if it's hitting at the very top level like that, I continue to be horrified by what a lot of Canadians out there are going to be facing, which actually is, sorry, Greg, it's finish the thought. You were about to jump in there.
I was just going to say, we've asked Canadians whether shrinkflation is a thing they've noticed, right? You buy a box of something and there's less crackers in it or whatever. To your point, the quality just going down at top-notch places where people have a high expectation of quality. And there could be a lot of things driving that. There could be cost constraints on restaurants. Restaurants, so very, very low margin or tight margin. Yeah. But everybody, when that apple became $2 and never went back to $1, that affected the entire economy. And so that's probably why you're seeing what you see. And then a more nefarious read is that, some folks are taking advantage, and maybe I think you guys had an article about the shitification of things.
Yeah, it was me. Yeah.
Shitification going on as well on purpose.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true to an extent. But what's worth pointing out, this is just the funnest way of capturing this. A pound of bacon is no longer a pound; it's 3/4 of a pound.
Yeah,
like when you go to a store and you buy the thing that for my entire life was a pound of bacon. Like that was how it was packaged. Here is a package that contains 1 pound of sliced bacon. It's 3/4 of a pound now. I was not consulted on that. It just happened.
Well, Subway started measuring their sandwiches in centimeters.
Yes. They find ways. All right. we're going to take a very quick break. We're going to come back in a minute. My guest, as before, is Gregory Jack of Ipsos Canada, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs there. We're going to talk immigration in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. This episode of the Line Podcast is also brought to you by the Daily Bread Food Bank. Imagine choosing between food, rent, or medicine. For the 1.5 million Canadians with disabilities living in poverty, that is the daily reality. The Canada Disability Benefit was created to help, but at less than $7 a day, it isn't enough. Daily Bread Food Bank and coalition partners are urging government to fully fund the benefit. Visit fundthebenefit.ca to take action. Together, we can ensure every Canadian with a disability has the dignity of food and security. Here we are, back once more, and Greg, it's there's a certain irony here. You won't have heard this because the way we record this, but you and I were just talking about cost of living, especially on the vulnerable. The ad we just ran was from the Daily Bread Food Bank talking about marginal, well, I shouldn't say marginal Canadians. That's not a nice way of putting it. Canadians who are living on the margins is a much nicer way of putting it, and how government supports have not kept up with, you guessed it, the cost of living. So one of the things, so Greg and I just had a long conversation. We're talking about a ton of the issues that right now Canadians are identifying as important to them. One of the ones we carved out was immigration. And I had asked Greg to pull some numbers for me. And this is why I befriend pollsters, because like it's better than Wikipedia. Like I just email my buddies and I'm like, I need to know what people think about this over the last 20 years. There's a hunch I've had, Greg, and it's not the most original insight in the world. Other people have been talking about it, and I've written about it myself, but I have a feeling it's accelerating. And I'm going to tell you what my hunch is. I think Canada collectively is souring on immigration. I don't know yet if we're souring on immigrants. I still think it's possible for people to think we have too much immigration in the abstract, but I really like my neighbor. I don't think if we've tipped over in that way yet. And it's also worth noting that I think you can talk a bit about the data. I think Canadians have always been more supportive of diversity in the abstract. Like I'm okay living with people of different faiths, colors, and creeds than they have been with a large scale immigration. So I think we've always been better at looking at our neighbor and liking them than we have looking at the idea of a bunch more people just like our neighbor suddenly moving in. So I think there's always been a bit of a tension there. I still think Canadians are tolerant of people who are different from them. I think we're good at that. But I do think immigration as a whole is increasingly unpopular in this country. And I think that number is moving pretty quickly. So you've pulled those numbers. What are you seeing?
Matt, I think, first of all, I think you put it quite right. The tolerance for immigration versus the tolerance for immigrants, we're talking about two different things. But, we ask Canadians, very simple question. We've been asking this for well over a decade. There are too many immigrants in my country. And we ask this actually around the world. Back in 2013.
And that's how you phrase it. It's just that blunt. Like the question is, there are too many immigrants in my country. Agree, disagree.
Full stop. And so back in 2013, that number actually was kind of high when you think about it. In 2013, it was 47%. Now, some of those people are somewhat agreeing and some are strongly agreeing, and they're put together. So, we don't have that drawn out. But, 47% were saying that. Well, now, 2025, so 12 years later, we're up to 63%. And it was 55% last year. So what happened was, over the decade from about we'll call it 2013, 2014 to about COVID, it was around 40%. Actually, it was going down. The best it was right in the middle of COVID, 2021, it was only 35% of Canadians who were saying that. But now it's gone much, much higher. And I should tell you that global average, I think, is about 63. So we're right around where we should be. When we look at countries that have seen this increase, most countries it has gone up. The one country where it has not gone up, where it's gone down, is the United States. And there's a bunch of possible reasons for that. One of them might be that, people feel like the president has dealt with that problem now. And so we don't have that problem of all those immigrants here anymore. Another reason, I think, is that there is a split in the States between Democrats and Republicans, that anytime you look at data from the United States, you've got to look at that split because it's such a divided society on so many things. But what the number does suggest is that tolerance for immigration, as you put it, might be lowering. And we've seen the government react to that. We saw Prime Minister Trudeau, and then continued under Carney. They've dropped our targets. Now, this is going to become a problem later on, as I said, with the cost of living and all that, and our workforce. Daryl Bricker, our global CEO, wrote a book called Empty Planet, where he talked about global population decline and all of the bad things that's going to lead to. We don't have a high enough birth rate in this country to replace our population. So whether you want more immigration or not, or whether you think there's too many, that is going to be one of the ways that we replace our population. But what I think has happened is we let a lot of new Canadians in, and Canadians were very open to this. They were like, we want to open our doors, but we didn't have the housing supports, the medical supports, the integration supports, all of the things you need to accommodate people coming into the country. Plus, we've let in a lot of refugees. We've let in Ukrainian refugees. We've let Syrian refugees under Mr. Trudeau in. And again, this is all things that I think Canadians notionally support these ideas, but now they're seeing, a lot of social problems helping these people integrate. And they're saying, we need to, going back to the conversation we had before the break, me before we, and take care of Canada first. So that's some of the stuff I think is behind those numbers.
I was joking with you in the first segment that, like, when I make guesses about things, if I'm right, I immediately claim the credit. And if I was wrong, I insist I guess something different, right? Like, hey, call them this game. No one's actually going to go see what I wrote. But one of the things I did write years ago, and I wrote it for Global, where you do some writing as well, was that there was already growing signs in the Western world of an anti-immigrant backlash, and that Canada had been largely immune from it. So across Europe, it was really fascinating to see, because it kind of moved from east to west across Europe, but the migration crisis of the late 2010s really soured the public on immigration. And the Americans had been becoming very hardline on the border, the southern border, for a number of years. And as you've noted, that seems to be reversing itself now. And that's something we're going to have to mull over. Canada had been a relatively isolated country where immigration support was high and stable. Mm-hmm. But I remember looking at those numbers years ago, and this is why I drew the distinction between supporting immigrants and supporting immigration. Again, support for having diversity in your community in Canada has always been much higher than support for immigration itself. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like, once they're here, we love them. We just don't want them to come. And I know, I don't know what the public policy way of summarizing that is, but that actually does seem to be how Canadians feel. And for what it's worth, anecdotally, I know Canadians who are incredibly anti-immigration now, but who love their immigrant neighbors, or they're married to an immigrant. So I do think there is a bit of a disconnect between immigrants and immigration. But what I was writing about years ago is that we'd better not ruin this. This is something that actually Canada has been really, really good at. And when you were, you have those numbers handy? I don't have them. What is too many immigrants in my country? What is the number for this year and last year?
Well, this year, like I said, was, sorry, just have to pull it up. 63, and last year was 55.
So that's an 8-point swing in a year.
Yeah.
All of the problems that I think are exacerbating anti-immigration sentiment in this country are worse this year than they were last year. What's that number going to be next year? Because you were talking about in 2013, it was 47%.
Yeah. So
basically we needed 11 years to move 8%. And then we needed one more year to move another 8%. Look, these things don't have to stay steady, but sometimes the number isn't what interests me. It's the velocity of the change.
And the velocity has been, since 2021, has really been the increase. When all of these affordability and inflation things started kicking in, and when the government started changing its policies around, how many newcomers we bring in, I think that there is a really good point you made, is we had this rare consensus in the population that we were open and tolerant and accepting of all of this. We didn't have a lot of those problems that you mentioned that other countries might have had. I still fundamentally don't believe that Canadians are anti-immigrant or anti-racist or are racist. I think that they are quite happy to live among a diverse population. They don't hate their neighbor, but I think that the pressures on the system and what they're seeing the government doing, not providing the right supports and the right mechanisms, is eating into their quality of life. When we talked about this earlier, doctor shortage. If we're letting in more people, that means more people need doctors, and I think they're coming at it from that perspective rather than a one of anti-immigrant point of view. But we still value diversity. But even that, we've seen, a slight drop in those who are saying that having a diverse population is a very good thing for my country. We've seen that in Canada go down from 82 to 67. So that's a considerable jump, right? And still, 7 out of 10 who agree with that. That's a pretty strong Canadian value. But that's declining too. And I think that the public policies behind it are part of the reason.
I should unmute myself before I speak. Look at me. I'm a broadcasting professional. I don't know where we're going to hit zero at this, or not zero. I don't know where we'll hit equilibrium. That's a better way of putting this. I don't know where these numbers are going to normalize. I was reading a story a few days ago, and you probably saw it. There's something, and some of my friends and colleagues at the National Post have actually done a really good job highlighting this, where there's been a series of cases. I don't know how widespread it is yet. I think we're still at the anecdotal stage, but there's been a series of cases where judges have handed out relatively lenient sentences against someone who's in Canada on a temporary immigration path so that their immigration efforts are not disrupted. And I'm just thinking to myself, we were talking a few minutes ago, right, about convoy versus Gaza protests. Oh boy, I don't want to be able to look at a court ruling and take a guess about why the judge is making that decision and have a pretty high likelihood of accuracy. I want that to be a mystery, and it's not.
Yeah.
And there was this story I was reading, Greg, and you might have seen it. The details are a little tabloid trashy. But basically, there was an immigrant who was living in a house and had, I don't know if it was with a camera or a peephole or something, but he was spying on female roommates while they were in the bathroom. And that's you. Like, I don't want to get
not good stuff.
No, bad. And it's just gross. I don't even like talking about that. But one of the things that was buried in the article that jumped out at me, not with the tabloid detail, was that house had 13 people living in it. And they weren't a family. They were just roommates who were forced to share a small home with limited bathrooms because of the housing issues that immigrants are facing here. And I don't blame immigrants, and I'm very careful about doing this for issues with rising crime and public safety. My gut feeling is that most of the people we let into this country are too busy delivering Uber Eats and desperately trying to make a living for themselves to commit many crimes. But I am telling you, man, I am seeing anecdotal signs of Canadians is getting fed up and moving towards that attitude of kick them all out. And that would be a really nasty thing. One of the reasons I wanted to talk with you about this today was a week ago, Jen Gerson interviewed Tony Keller of the Globe and Mail. That was the last On the Line episode before this one. I thought it was a great episode. But one of the things I wanted just to talk with you a little about, how low will support for immigration go? And how low can it go before we start seeing support for immigrants start to come down? I don't think these two numbers are in total lock, but I don't think they're totally detached from each other either.
No, I think that there is a ways for us to go. We don't have a xenophobic political party in Canada that is having any sort of, anything other than marginal breakthrough. All of the parties still very publicly support a diverse Canada. The Conservative Party is calling for policy changes and reforming the system, not for an outright ban on immigration or new Canadians. So I think that we're actually better off than you might think based on the numbers. How low can they go? I think really depends on a lot of the factors that you just listed off, right? Because all of these things are correlated. If there's not housing and if there's not jobs in that, and people are coming in to the country, then then they're going to have to do what they have to do to survive. But the other thing that is happening is a lot of people are coming to Canada, living here for 5-7 years, and then leaving. And they're saying, you know what, this is not what I was promised.
This is not what we were promised.
There was I don't remember the name of it, but there's a study on this, the leaky bucket study, I believe it's called, that talks about this and how, this great promise of Canada, and we have a great country, but the great promise for a lot of people who are coming here, who should want to be coming here to solve the big problems that we have, are arriving and deciding that maybe it's not as good as we say, and going to go somewhere else. So that's an equal problem. People leaving Canada, the brain drain as well. Especially, it's especially a problem if they've come here first and then chosen to leave.
This is something I've been banging on about for a couple of years, and it's really hard to track. A couple of years ago, I began to think, because of anecdotes, and anecdotes aren't data, so I heard the anecdotes, and then I went looking for the data. I talking to some of the guys at StatsCan, and I said to them, I think people are leaving. And they said, we think so too. And I'm like, how do you prove it? And they go, it's really hard because our population numbers capture bulk numbers. So if we're letting in an absolute ton of people, and I think everyone now acknowledges, so I don't mean this as a political comment, but under the Trudeau years, we kind of lost track. I don't think we have a great handle on this right now. So as long as the population number is still going up, a rapid influx will cover a migration out of people who are self-selecting and just going, this isn't for us. Some of that is going to be the leaky bucket you were talking about, people coming to Canada for a while, maybe cooling their heels here a bit before going to the United States. I know this is something the American government is worried about, that Canada is turning itself into a lobby for eventual American immigrants who will move through. Some of it is unimmigration or remigration. There's different terms for it. But I know people personally who, whether being here for a brief period or even a long period, just said, you know what? My quality, like the home country is settled down and stabilized. I can sell my house in Toronto and buy a mansion in the home country and then buy little houses for all my kids. We're out of here. And I know people who've done that. But I also think there's native-born Canadians who are just going, you know what? I have better healthcare. I have better public safety. I have better business opportunities elsewhere. And all of these things start to combine, right? Where I was telling you before, some of these social indicators, they're not great, but they're rational choices on an individual level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that there's a good portion of Canadians who would really, if they looked around the world and they looked at some of the things that are available in terms of healthcare and that sort of thing, would say, we should have that here. Why don't we have that here? The gradual erosion of our institutions and the federal government has struggled mightily with service. I've written a number of things about public services, literally public service.
Yep.
This has become a real problem. And I think, the Canada Post strike is one that I brought up earlier. And I think that that's a real indicator of the me versus we sort of mentality, and how a lot of people are looking at this and going, this corporation is insolvent. How is it possible that you are going to do what they're asking for? How does that relate to immigration? I mean, this is the Postal Service. It's one of those things that, we expect government to take care of, and it is not being taken care of. Whether we need a post office that operates the same way as it does now, or it could be privatized, is a different discussion. But what I'm talking about is the fundamental basic things that we kind of expect to work are not maybe working as well as they should be. And so when somebody comes here with the great promise of Canada and discovers these basic things don't work, it's no wonder that they're rethinking their decision, if that's in fact what's happening. But, the guys at StatsCan would know. They have good numbers.
Yeah, but boy, sometimes you got to infer. You can't always track. You got to infer. And they didn't think I was wrong. They just couldn't prove it. And I thought that was interesting. One more question for you, and then I'm going to let you go, and then we can start our long weekends. And by the way, for everyone listening to this on Tuesday, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. Hasn't happened for Greg and me yet. You said a few minutes ago, in the context of the immigration consensus, that one of the things we have going for us is that we have no political party right now in the mainstream that is anti-immigration. And that's true. And very recently, I was talking here on one of these podcasts about how the conservatives, I think it was, if I remember correctly, I was talking with Stephanie Levitz of the Globe and Mail, how the conservatives have impressed me by holding the line on what I think is a very reasonable immigration take. I think they have actually, and I have spoken with senior conservatives who tell me it's hard. Like there is a faction of our base that wants us to slam the door at least, but we're resisting that. And I give the conservatives full credit for that because they have resisted that. There was a really interesting story this week for us, last week for the listeners, where Michelle Rempel Garner had, I thought, a very thoughtful essay that she released where she was saying we need to reevaluate birthright citizenship because of what you and I were saying a few minutes ago. We kind of lost track of who's in the country over the last few years. And if we're going to try and clean this problem up, it's going to be really harder if there are, and I hate the term, but if there's the so-called anchor babies here, where people who shouldn't be in this country have a baby while in the country and then get to stay in the country because they have a Canadian baby. And I think that's a completely reasonable proposal that is warranted by the fact that the Trudeau government has, to everyone's knowledge, lost control of immigration. But I thought it was damned interesting to see the Conservatives saying so.
Yeah. Well,
are we going to see a political consensus around immigration hold? I don't know.
I think that, and there are some folks who have suggested the Conservatives are anti-immigration, but I don't see any evidence of that. I think that, you look at the leader, his wife is an immigrant. This is a very open, tolerant country, and we have political parties that reflect that. But there are, as you point out, Matt, some on both sides of the spectrum who, for various reasons, want to start excluding some people for one reason or another. And I think that, we do have a risk in the future of having that kind of faction gain prominence and voice if we start to see the sorts of things we've seen in other countries where that's happened. And a lot of the problems I've talked about, the institutional failures, are the things that lead to that, right? When people no longer feel that their needs are being met and that their needs are not being met at the expense of somebody else's needs being met, then that's when you kind of see that coming up. But I don't see any evidence of it right now, nor do I have any numbers to measure Michelle Rempel's proposal. It would be interesting to know what Canadians thought of that.
Well, we'll check in with you in a few weeks, but my gut feeling is they'll be just fine with it because I thought it was a pretty reasonable proposal. Not to denaturalize anyone and not to make life harder for immigrants, but to make sure Canadian citizenship is not something that can be finagled. I don't think that's going to pull badly for whichever party ends up advocating it. And I'll leave you with this, Greg. I'll make one more political comment here. Looking at how Liberals responded to what Michelle Rempel Garner told me, what Michelle Rempel Garner said publicly, told me that the Liberals don't get that this is a losing issue for them if they're not careful. And I think in the last couple of years, we've seen the Liberals downplay housing until they couldn't. We've seen them, I think, downplay crime and bail and public safety issues until they couldn't. And I would suggest to my Liberal friends that based on their recent comments and based on what I'm hearing and some of the numbers that you do have, this is going to be that next issue where the Liberals might have to have a bit of a come to Jesus moment, where they start to realize that their maximalist positions that are playing really well on Twitter might not be landing with the electorate. And I think, Greg, I don't disagree with anything you've said. I do still think the Canadian population is fairly moderate on this issue, but I think they're pissed off enough that if they get any whiff of someone exploiting the system, they're not going to react to that well.
Yeah.
Leave it at that. Greg, since it hasn't happened yet, happy Thanksgiving to you, the family. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And we'll check in with you again soon, but I always appreciate you coming by. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Matt.
Well, it's over. That's the On the Line. We've recorded it. It's ready to go on time so that it can be ready for you over the long weekend. By the time you hear or see this, Thanksgiving will be behind us, but still, in spirit, I'm wishing you all a happy Thanksgiving because it hasn't happened yet. In any case, I hope the long weekend that is behind us, was excellent, that you had a great time. Thank you for being here. Lots of great content rolling out from your buddies at The Line this week. Check us out at www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe to us there. Whatever app or streaming platform you enjoyed this episode on, like and subscribe to us there as well. Tell your friends, tell your enemies. We'll talk with you soon. Take good care.